That was the startup sound that kicked off the first ever console war.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one?
They took on Nintendo and won.
The video game craze, the Nintendo craze, but this year Nintendo may be up against some serious competition.
Then came the real fight, not with rivals, but with itself.
Sega!
This is how Sega, the company that changed gaming twice, died twice. It's the 90s. Nintendo doesn't just make games, it owns the market. There's no such thing as a console war because there's no war to fight. Everyone else is already dead. They control licensing, pricing, and even shelf space. If you want Mario on your shelf, you play by their rules. They threatened retailers not to carry competing products. They threatened developers who dared make games for other systems. Sure, Nintendo was friendly on the surface, but they were brutal behind the scenes. Even the government took notice.
Federal and state officials charged today that Nintendo threatened to cut off supplies of its video games if retailers charged less than Nintendo wanted.
As a law violator, a lawbreaker, you did wrong to your loyal customers.
The Department of Justice opened an antitrust investigation into Nintendo's business practices. And when it was over, Nintendo settled for $5 million, and for the rest of the fine, they mailed out millions of rebate coupons to customers. Coupons that could only be used to buy more Nintendo games. Which is ruthless, but kind of genius. That's how untouchable Nintendo was. And that's the world Sega was trying to compete in. Enter Tom Kalinske, a former Mattel executive who once sold Barbie dolls and Hot Wheels. He's not a gamer, he's not a tech guy, he's a marketer. Not exactly the kind of guy you'd think would start a war with Nintendo. And he was on vacation in Hawaii with his wife and kids, lying on the beach, not thinking about work.
And all of a sudden, this guy appears. It was Hayao Nakayama, CEO of Sega of Japan. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm looking for you." I said, "Well, I want you to come to Japan with me because we've got this great 16-bit technology. We want you to run Sega and take on Nintendo."
And I argued with him. I didn't really want to go. But my daughter, Ashley, said, "This man came all the way from Japan to find you. You have to go back with him to see what he's talking about."
He flew to Tokyo, saw Sega's new technology, and that trip changed everything. It set in motion the fight that would spark the first true console war. When Kalinske arrives in California, Sega of America looks like a startup, 30 people sharing cubicles, and Japanese managers living out of motels. Nintendo, meanwhile, is continuing to threaten retailers not to stock competing consoles. Sega can't even get shelf space. But Kalinske knew something that Sega of Japan didn't. America didn't want family friendly, it wanted some attitude. So Kalinske fights dirty. He drops the Genesis price to $149, bundles Sonic the Hedgehog for free, and then kicks off the console war with a genius tagline.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit arcade action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade hits.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
What Nintendo don't.
Catchy, right? Well, it worked. They're marketing to teenagers, not kids. And that was only the opening shot, because Kalinske turned the Sega name into a literal war cry, a scream that was in your face, obnoxious, but unforgettable. And by 1993, Sega controlled more than half the US market. In the span of 2 years, the underdog rebel had overthrown the empire. Back in Tokyo though, not everyone's celebrating. Inside Sega's Tokyo headquarters, a group of senior managers watches the numbers come in from America. Record-breaking sales, endless headlines, and they're furious. Many senior staff bristle at the idea that the US division's publicity-driven approach, with later interviews describing meetings that turned tense as cultural and managerial differences surfaced. Kalinski's freewheeling style, the price cuts, the marketing blitz, the TV commercials mocking Nintendo feels reckless, almost embarrassing. Middle managers in Japan whisper that he's destroying Sega's dignity. To them, he's a loud American showman riding on the back of Japanese craftsmanship. Nakayama, though, he loves it. He tells his Tokyo staff, let them do it their way. 2 cultures, 1 company. And that divide turned the console war from Sega versus Nintendo to Sega versus Sega. Inside Sega's Japan headquarters, the resentment boiled quietly. When Sega of America started outselling Nintendo, you'd think they would have been thrilled. They weren't. To them, it was luck, a marketing stunt led by a guy who didn't understand games. Behind his back, engineers undermined him, and meetings turned hostile at any mention of America. Nakayama was trapped between proud Japanese engineers and a brash American rewriting their industry's rules. Sega's identity was built on engineering. The programmers and designers were the artists. The marketing team, they were just decoration. But in America, Kalinske flipped that upside down. He made marketing the core of Sega's brand. To the US team, it wasn't about processors or polygons, it was about cool. In Japan, the engineers saw this as a desecration. Chief among them was Hideki Sato, head of Sega's hardware design division, a brilliant engineer responsible for the technical vision behind Sega's consoles. Sato was Kalinske's opposite, caring only about circuits and design, not slogans and ads. Then there was Yuji Naka, the man who created Sonic the Hedgehog. Brilliant, sure, but an absolute nightmare to work with. After Sonic's success, Sega of America formed a new hybrid team called the Sega Technical Institute, or STI for short, a mix of US and Japanese developers under one roof in California. But the culture clash was brutal. Naka refused to share code, insisting only Japanese developers understood Sonic's soul. He'd even rewrite teammates' work overnight, then berate them for not thinking like Sonic. The Americans saw him as an arrogant prima donna. The Japanese saw him as a genius protecting his craft. Both were right. By 1994, Kalinske was growing tired. Tired of fighting for ideas he'd already proven would win. Tired of the bureaucracy, and tired of the resentment. The tension became so bad that Nakayama himself had to fly back and forth between Japan and California just to keep the 2 sides talking. He defended Kalinske, but was fighting with managers and engineers who saw his tactics as a threat to Sega's pride. To them, America's flashy and sometimes goofy marketing distracted from what made Sega, Sega.
Now, when you buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1, you'll get Sonic 2 absolutely free. Sonic 2 handles stubborn stains, embarrassing bald spots, no problem. It even slices and dices, makes thousands of julienne fries. But wait, you can play it too. This free Sonic 2 is a $54.99 value. You get 2 Sonics for the price of 1. Sonic 2 fits easily into any tackle box. Made from a space-age polymer plastic for years of family fun. And pets love it too. Buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1 and get Sonic 2 free.
Act now. Wiener Dog sweaters sold separately.
When the Saturn project began in Japan, Kalinske begged them to slow down. He argued that the Genesis still had life left, that gamers weren't ready for another expensive console upgrade. But Sega of Japan pushed forward anyway, demanding new hardware every year to stay ahead. First came the Sega CD, that promised next-gen graphics, but delivered grainy FMV movies. Then came the 32X, another awkward add-on that stacked on top of the Genesis. Sega now had 3 devices, the Genesis, Sega CD, and the 32X, each with different games, cables, discs, and cartridges, all competing for the same shelf space and customer attention. Gamers weren't sure what worked with what. Some thought they were separate consoles, others didn't even know what version of the Genesis they needed. Now, imagine being a parent in the 90s and trying to understand how to Frankenstein this whole thing together. And developers didn't like it much either. Do they build for the Genesis? Do they build for the CD, the 32X, or a soon-to-arrive Saturn? Sato's engineers were rushing to finish the Saturn, a machine so complex it would confuse even Sega's own programmers. It was a pretty chaotic time at Sega, but things were about to get much worse. By 1994, Sega was exhausted. After years of battling Nintendo, with some success, The Genesis was aging, the 32X was confusing, and the company was eating itself from the inside. But the real threat wasn't Nintendo anymore. It was a new player, Sony. And Sony, they weren't coming to compete, they were coming to take over. Just a few years earlier, Sony wanted to join forces with Sega to develop the next game platform.
We were working together on the first CD, optical disc system of games. And I really got close with the Sony guys, with Olaf Olsson and Mickey Shuloff. And we decided that the wise thing to do would be to do a joint hardware system, a Sega-Sony hardware system. Because after all, we all lost money on hardware, so why not just do one new system, have it be Sega-Sony, and then each of us will benefit from the software we produce. Well, to me, this was a no-brainer. We were much better in those days at developing software than Sony was. And Mickey wanted to do it, Olaf wanted to do it. We went to Japan and we met with, in those days, IDEA and at Sony, and he agreed that was a smart thing to do. Went over to Sega, and Nakayama said, no, not going to do that. Those guys don't know anything about making video games. Why would you want to do a deal with Sony? So we didn't do a deal with Sony.
Yeah, hindsight's always 20/20. That decision didn't just end a partnership, it lit a fuse for a brand that would one day dominate gaming. Because while Sega's teams were too busy fighting each other, Sony quietly built their own machine. Sleek, affordable, and backed by the full force of their creative power. They called it PlayStation. And if that wasn't bad enough, news of Nintendo's 64-bit system dropped. Sega, they panicked. Nakayama ordered his engineers to catch up immediately, telling them, "We have to be first." Hideki Sato's team rushed to redesign their next console, the Saturn, bolting on extra processors until the hardware became a technical nightmare. 2 chips, dual architecture, nearly impossible to program for. Even Sega's own developers struggled to make games run on it. But Sega leadership, they didn't care. They were obsessed with being first, even if it meant being unready. And what happened next would finish what their civil war had already started. May 11th, 1995, Los Angeles, the first ever E3. Tom Kalinske walks into the convention center knowing exactly what he's going to say. He rehearsed it 100 times. Announce, tease, rebuild momentum. That's the plan. But Sega of Japan has other plans.
Nakayama-san was so paranoid about whatever Nintendo and Sony were going to launch that he demanded that we ship the Saturn literally in May at that E3 show, or at that same time. And we had to do it. I mean, we had no choice. Didn't want to. Didn't have enough hardware to supply every retailer with what they would need to make a decent showing at retail. So that was one huge problem. I had to literally piss off some very good friends of mine at Retail America. And on top of that, we didn't have hardly any software. So why would you introduce a hardware system without enough software at the same time? And so that pretty much made my mind up that, okay, the world has changed. I used to be able to make the decisions for the United States and the Western world. Can't really do that anymore. I'm being forced to do something that I know isn't going to work. I know it's going to fail. And so that was when I made my mind up to leave Sega.
It's the end of an era for Sega and for Tom Kalinske. That decision will become the biggest mistake in Sega's history. They didn't just lose the man who built Sega's empire in America, they lost one of the biggest retailers at the time. Within hours, KB Toys publicly announces they'll never sell Sega products again. And the Saturn launches with only 6 titles. No Sonic game, no killer app.
Obviously, we didn't even have Sonic, for God's sake, initially. And that was a huge, huge mistake.
But if you thought that was bad, it only got worse when Sony takes the stage.
$299.
That's it. $299. No pitch, no slides, just the price. You know, you really gotta hand it to Sony. They sure know how to twist a knife in their competition, especially at E3. The PlayStation is $100 cheaper than the Saturn. And by 1996, Sony owned 20% of the market. A year later, the Nintendo 64, or the N64, is released, and well, Sega's first death is complete. By 1997, morale was low, and Hayao Nakayama was running out of chances. He had one last gamble left, a merger with Bandai, the anime and toy powerhouse behind Dragon Ball Z and Gundam. On paper, it was a dream pairing. Sega's hardware and arcades, Bandai's characters and merchandise. The plan was to merge into one entertainment superpower that could challenge Sony's rising dominance. But the deal, it fell apart. Bandai employees openly protested the deal, saying Sega's culture was chaotic, and that Nakayama's management style would destroy Bandai's spirit. It was a public humiliation and the final straw for Nakayama. By January of '98, he resigned. Shoichiro Iramajiri, a former auto executive known as the Prince of Honda, stepped up to restore order. And in the background, Isao Okawa, the soft-spoken billionaire chairman who had bankrolled Sega for years, continued financially supporting the company. With Nakayama gone, Okawa and Iramajiri inherited a company on the edge of collapse, and a single mission: save Sega from itself. When Hideki Sato and his team presented their next console, it wasn't about bold promises, it was about proving Sega could still matter. Codename: Katana. For Hideki Sato, this was personal. He told colleagues later that Katana was his redemption project. The Saturn had been a disaster, and he wanted to prove Sega could still innovate without over-engineering itself to death. So this time, they learned. The new console would be simpler, easier for game developers to build on, and they'd even accept outside help. They partnered with Microsoft, using Windows CE as part of the system's software tools. Meanwhile, after years of internal warfare, Sega of Japan and Sega of America were starting to work closer together. Sato opened up engineering communication lines with Sega of America, something unheard of during the Saturn years. Even Yuji Naka, still moody but loyal, returned to lead a next-generation Sonic game, codenamed Project Adventure. The concept was visionary, a console built for the internet, with a built-in modem and an eye toward online play. When they finally decided on a name, it felt symbolic. September 9th, 1999. The Dreamcast launched in the US on the most perfect marketing date imaginable. It was fast, it was sleek, and online. The first console that let you browse, download, and play with friends over dial-up. Sure, it sounded like a fax machine being electrocuted, but it was the future. 500,000 consoles sold in the first 2 weeks. For Hideki Sato and his engineers, there was immense pride in what they did. After years of failure and friction, the Dreamcast finally worked. It was elegant, developer-friendly, and everything the Saturn wasn't. Sato later said the team built this one from a place of love, not fear. For a moment, it looked like the comeback was real. The Dreamcast was a hit. But even inside the company, even as hope returned, old grudges and old habits lingered, and no one felt those more than Peter Moore, now running Sega of America. After the Saturn's disaster, third-party developers didn't trust Sega. And if the Dreamcast was going to win, Moore needed to rebuild trust, not just with gamers, but with third-party game makers.
Spent a lot of time in Japan meeting with the Konamis and the Capcoms and the Namcos and what are you guys going to do? And being there with Sega of Japan, figuring out what their longer term strategy was going to be, because I think everybody had focused on, we're going to do one game and see how it goes. We're going to do maybe a second game if we get an install base that makes fiscal sense, because these are dev resources that you just have to figure out where they're best deployed. And I think, I remember going over there and sitting in the headquarters of these companies and with my Japanese counterparts and trying to convince them that there was longevity in this platform and that they shouldn't move over to PlayStation, which of course was going to ship in March of the following year. But tough conversation to have, because I think a lot of these folks have been burned by previous commitments and promises on previous Sega consoles.
And there were some other issues. Yuji Naka, Sonic's brilliant but volatile creator, micromanaged his team to exhaustion, scrapped entire levels at the last minute, and refused outside input. When Peter Moore's team asked for a Western-friendly marketing cut of the game, Naka refused. He reportedly told them, "You Americans don't understand Sonic."
Flying back from San Francisco to Tokyo, to Haneda, Sega headquarters, and meeting with the dev teams. And, it didn't help that we were very heavily reliant on Tokyo-based dev teams that continued to resist the movement to broader content. I'll call it more Western content. And so, we constantly were kind of peering through the window of what everybody was making there of the 9 development studios. And they would make what they wanted to make that they felt was appropriate primarily.
And finally, he knew a larger threat was looming, the PlayStation 2.
You could see that unless we could get that momentum, the writing was on the wall. And I've always said this publicly, Sony did a brilliant job of fudding everybody, placing fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and positioning the Dreamcast as a transitional platform. You can have some fun for a few months with the Dreamcast, and then when the real thing comes out in March of 2001, you can move over.
So here's the tragedy. The Dreamcast was ahead of its time, pioneering online play and downloadable content before it was a thing. But dial-up was still standard, and broadband barely existed. Even Hideki Sato admitted, "We built the future, but the future didn't wait for us." Meanwhile, Sony offered something simpler, a DVD player that also played games. Guess which one families bought? It was over. The second death was complete. January 31st, 2001. 5 straight years of losses. Sega is broke. Sony dominating. Nintendo surviving. And now, Microsoft entering with the Xbox. With that, the Dreamcast is discontinued. Sega exits the hardware business for good. Peter Moore, now the public face of Sega, had to deliver the bad news to employees and fans. At first, fans didn't believe it. Sega always bounced back. They had to. But there was no fight left against Sony, Nintendo, and now Microsoft. Yuji Naka and his Sonic team pivoted to the GameCube. Within months, Sega, the company built on destroying Nintendo, was suddenly making Sonic games for the Nintendo. The hedgehog who once mocked Mario now shared his console. Sega may have exited the hardware business, but reinvents itself as a software company making games. But one man made sure Sega didn't die in debt. Chairman Okawa, the quiet billionaire who had kept Sega alive through its worst years, forgave millions in loans he gave to Sega. Weeks later, he passed away. It's the last noble act in a story built on pride. When Sega left the hardware business, it didn't disappear. It scattered ideas across the games industry. Some Sega veterans later took roles elsewhere, most famously Peter Moore, who took some of that rebellious marketing to help shape Xbox culture. Meanwhile, Hideki Sato stayed behind in Tokyo, quietly overseeing Sega's shift to software before retiring. He finally got the redemption he'd been chasing. Modern consoles now use the very simplicity he fought for too late. Yuji Naka led the Sonic team into the 2000s, still chasing perfection long after the world moved on. 2 decades later, though, his story ended a little strangely. Arrested and convicted for insider trading in 2023. That might be a whole nother video. Sega stopped building hardware, but never stopped building worlds. They kept making the weird, wonderful games no one else would. Sega didn't vanish, it adapted. The Dreamcast failure became everyone else's playbook. Online gaming, digital distribution, all things Sega did first, just a little too early. They invented the console war and became its first major casualty. They made gaming cool and turned marketing into warfare. They taught Nintendo to fight and Sony to win. And every bold reveal, every viral ad, every next-gen promise since then traces back to one moment. A toy salesman on a Hawaiian beach saying yes to a Japanese visionary who believed a rebel could change gaming.